I had refused every woman my grandmother placed before me for 11 years, and she had placed before me a great many. Countesses, viscountesses, the daughters of earls who owned half of Northumbria, women of fortune and pedigree, and in several cases, genuine loveliness, women any sensible man in England would have been grateful to call his duchess. I refused them all. I refused them at dinner tables, at garden parties, in the long gallery at Strathmore where my grandmother arranged her little theatrical introductions with the precision of a military campaign. I refused them politely, and then, when the season brought fresh troops to her cause, I refused them again. My grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Strathmore, bore each refusal with what I can only describe as the patience of a woman who knew something I did not. She never argued. She never wept. She simply pressed her lips together, folded her hands on the ivory handle of her cane, and looked at me with those sharp gray eyes as though I were a theorem she had already solved and was merely waiting for me to catch up. I was 34 years old, the 8th Duke of Strathmore, master of 12,000 acres from the Northumbrian coast to the high moors, and I was afraid of my grandmother. Any man who tells you he is not afraid of such a woman is either lying or has never met her. I should say in my own defense that I had reasons for my refusals. Good reasons, I believed at the time. The last 11 years had not been idle ones. There had been the restoration of the South Wing after the fire of 1841, which had consumed my father along with the timbers and left me the dukedom at 23, unready and bewildered. There had been the reform of the tenants' cottages on the eastern edge of the estate, which my steward Drummond had resisted with the ferocity of a man who had lived pleasantly in the old way for 30 years and did not intend to stop. There had been 3 bad harvests in a row, a disputed boundary with the Marquis of Ardenley that ended in court and took 4 years to resolve, and woven through all of it, the bone-deep loneliness that a man of my nature would sooner ride into a January sea than admit aloud. But my grandmother knew, she always knew. It was in the autumn of 1852 that she summoned me to Strathmore for what she called a matter of some delicacy. I arrived to find the great house dressed for company, fires lit in every room, the silver polished, the long dining table set for 8, and my grandmother standing in the entrance hall in her finest black silk, a faint smile at the corner of her mouth that I had learned to regard with profound suspicion. "You've gone to some trouble," I said. "I always go to some trouble," she replied, "when I am right." I was given no further explanation. The guests arrived before I could press her. 2 neighboring families whose names I shall spare, a young clergyman from the village of Aldenmere, and at the very last, a woman I had never seen before. She came in from the cold with her cloak still about her shoulders, unpinning it in the entrance hall with quick, efficient movements, and handed it to the footman without a word of direction. Not because she was indifferent to the servants, I understood later, but because she had been one, or as close to one as a gently born young woman with no fortune and no family could be when taken in by a great house as a dependent. Her name was Miss Alara Voss. My grandmother introduced her simply as my ward of several years, quite indispensable to me, and said nothing more, which was itself a statement. In my grandmother's vocabulary, the word indispensable was applied to very few things: a good Madeira, Drummond in the management of the home farm, and apparently Alara Voss. I barely registered her at first. The drawing room held 7 people that evening, and I was braced for the usual campaign. The young woman steered toward the piano at the precise moment I might be expected to stand nearby and listen. The casual seating at dinner that placed her to my right. The leading observation, "Miss Aldbury is remarkably accomplished, is she not, Callum?" that my grandmother wielded like a surgeon's instrument. I watched for all of it, with the vigilance of a man who has navigated 11 seasons of the same operation. What I was not watching for was the woman in the corner. She had taken the chair nearest the fireplace and slightly behind the main conversation, as though she had spent long practice in making herself the least conspicuous person in a room. She was perhaps 24, slight, with dark hair simply dressed and a gown of deep blue wool that had been well made once and carefully kept since. Her face was quiet, not blank, I noticed upon second glance, but carefully controlled, the way a person learns to hold themselves when they have grown used to being looked through. She was listening to the clergyman's account of his parish with what appeared to be genuine attention, and once, when he said something that struck her as funny, she laughed, a brief, unguarded sound, quickly contained, and then glanced up and found me watching her. She did not color and look away. She met my eyes for one composed, steady moment, offered a small nod that might have meant anything, and returned her attention to the clergyman. I thought about that nod for the rest of the evening. Dinner was everything my grandmother had planned, which is to say it was excellent and arranged with the invisible architecture of a woman who understood that pleasure and strategy need not conflict. I was seated, as ever, at the head of the table. My grandmother sat at the foot, presiding with that unsettling air of serene authority she had perfected over 70 years. The guests filled the middle, and Miss Voss sat at the far left near my grandmother, almost out of my line of sight, and said very little. I noticed this because I spent a disproportionate amount of the meal attempting to hear what little she did say. What I managed to catch was worth catching. When the conversation turned to the new rail extension that the county council was proposing through the lower valley, a subject on which 3 of my neighbors had warm and nearly identical opinions, it was Miss Voss who asked, quietly, whether anyone had consulted the farmers whose drainage channels the line would cut. The clergyman looked surprised. One of the neighboring wives looked at her as though she had spoken in an unfamiliar language. My grandmother took a slow sip of her Madeira and said nothing at all, which was the loudest thing she had done all evening. After dinner, I found a moment alone with my grandmother in the small library off the hall, while the other guests arranged themselves around the card tables. "You've been unusually restrained tonight," I told her. "You haven't once suggested that anyone in particular would make me an excellent duchess." "No," she agreed. "That is either a victory for me or a strategy on your part." "Callum," she said, and set down her glass with a small, precise sound, "in 11 years I have introduced you to 17 women of excellent character and suitable connection. You found fault with each of them within the first quarter hour. I have concluded that the direct approach does not suit your temperament. And the indirect approach consists of placing a woman in the corner and hoping I find my own way to her." My grandmother smiled. It was the smile of the theorem already solved. "I have never in my life hoped," she said. "I have observed and I have arranged. What you choose to do with the arrangement is, as always, your own affair." She left me with that. I stood for a moment in the empty library, listening to the sound of laughter from the card room and the low crack of the fire, and then I went in search of Miss Alara Voss. I found her not at the card tables, but at the window at the far end of the hall, looking out at the dark park where the first frost of November was silvering the grass. "You don't play," I said. She turned. She had been deep in thought and I had surprised her, but she recovered without fuss. "I play tolerably," she said. "I prefer not to when there's a window and a frost." It was such an unexpected answer that I almost laughed. I came to stand beside her at the window, a proper distance away, and looked out at the same frost. "My grandmother tells me you have been with her several years," I said. "6 years, since my father died and the house was sold for his debts." She said it plainly, without apology or appeal. It was simply a fact, stated in the same tone she might have used to note the weather: cold tonight, frost settling early. I found that I respected it enormously. "And before that?" "Before that I was the daughter of a country solicitor in Cheshire who read too many books and left his family nothing but a good library, which was also sold." She paused. "I kept 3 volumes. Your grandmother allowed me to take them." "Which 3? She looked at me and I saw in her expression the same small calculation I had seen earlier, the brief weighing of whether this was a question worth answering, whether I was worth the answer. "Virgil," she said at last. "An English herbal from the previous century, and a collection of mathematical problems my father worked through in the margins." "You read mathematics?" "I read my father's handwriting in the margins of his mathematics. It is not quite the same thing." She paused. "Though I do follow the problems." We stood for a moment at the frost-bright window, and I was aware of something I had not felt in the vicinity of any woman my grandmother had placed before me in 11 years. The sensation of being in the presence of a mind I had not yet measured, and of wanting to. "Miss Voss," I said, "what do you make of my grandmother's evening?" "I think," she said carefully, "that your grandmother is a very clever woman who has taken considerable trouble, and that it would be impolite to say more than that in her house, to her grandson." "And outside her house?" "To someone other than her grandson." She looked at me again, and this time the small smile that lived at the corner of her mouth, the one that had been so carefully contained all evening, escaped just enough to be seen. "Outside her house," she said. "I would say that she has arranged this evening with the kind of precision that suggests she is entirely certain of something the rest of us are still working out." "And what do you believe she is certain of?" "That," she said and turned back to the window, "would be impolite to say in any house." I laughed. I could not help it, a real laugh, the kind I had not produced in a drawing room for longer than I cared to remember. She glanced at me, startled by it, and then the contained smile broke into something genuine and brief, and she looked away again, out at the frost. I went to bed that night thinking about Alara Voss, with a clarity that I had not brought to any thought in a considerable while. The difficulty, and there was a difficulty, when I spent the following week at Strathmore declining to examine directly, was that I could not simply pursue the matter in the ordinary way. The ordinary way, when a duke of my standing wished to know a woman better, was a system of calls and cards and contrived encounters that the whole county would observe and interpret immediately. The interpretive apparatus of rural Northumbrian society was as precise as a chronometer and considerably less discreet. If I called twice in a fortnight on the Dowager Duchess of Strathmore, and it happened both times that Miss Voss was in the sitting room, the thing would be decided in the county's mind before I had decided it in my own. And I did not wish it decided before I had decided it. I had spent 11 years refusing women chosen for me, and I was not prepared to have a woman chosen for me now simply because my grandmother had been clever enough to put her in a corner and leave me to find her. Even if my grandmother was right. Even if, and this was the thought I had been declining to examine, she had always been right. So I stayed at Strathmore. I rode the south boundary with Drummond in the mornings. I worked through the estate accounts in the afternoons. And in the evenings I sat by the fire in the library and did not think about Miss Voss's comment on mathematical margins, or the way she had looked out at the frost, or that brief, unguarded laugh she had caught and contained before it could embarrass her. I was very unsuccessful at not thinking about any of it. On the 5th day, I rode to the Dowager's house on the pretense of returning a book I had borrowed some weeks previously. It was a thin pretense, and my grandmother received it with the magnanimity of a woman who has no need to point out the thinness of pretenses. She was in her upstairs sitting room when I arrived, and she was alone. Miss Voss, the housekeeper, told me was in the garden. In November. My grandmother watched me receive this information and said serenely, "She takes the air every afternoon at 2 o'clock regardless of the weather. She says the cold clarifies her thinking. I have stopped arguing with it." I handed over the book. "I'll leave this with you then," I said. "Of course," said my grandmother. I was at the garden gate 3 minutes later. It was a walled garden, sheltered enough that the worst of the November wind found it only in gusts. She was walking the gravel path along the south wall, her dark cloak pulled close, her breath visible in the cold air, and she was reading, actually reading, holding a small volume open with one gloved hand and navigating the path by long habit. She heard my boots on the gravel and looked up. "Your Grace," she said, and there was surprise in her voice, genuine surprise, which told me something important. My grandmother had not warned her. "Miss Voss," I fell into step beside her, at a distance that the garden's narrowness made only slightly less than scandalous. I returned a book. "A very important errand in November." "Critically important." She closed her own book, keeping her place with one finger. "Your grandmother will be pleased to see you." "My grandmother," I said, "is upstairs being pleased from a distance. She is very accomplished at it." A pause, then, "You are not, I think, a man who calls on a Tuesday in November to return books." "No," I admitted, "I am not." She stopped walking. We stood on the gravel path with the gray sky above the garden wall and the smell of cold earth around us. And I looked at her, really looked at her, in the flat, honest light of a November afternoon without candlelight or the social orchestration of a dinner table. And she was not beautiful in the way the women my grandmother had previously placed before me were beautiful. She was something else. She was a face that told the truth about itself. The quiet determination in the set of her jaw, the intelligence in those dark eyes that had spent 6 years watching a great household from the careful margin of it. The composure that was not coldness, but the dignified armor of a woman who had lost everything and rebuilt herself inside someone else's house, and come through it without bitterness. She was, I realized, with a clarity that arrived like the November light, sudden and without sentiment, the most honest thing I had looked at in 11 years. I have been attempting, I said, to determine whether my grandmother has been very wise or very manipulative. In my experience, said Alara Voss, with your grandmother those are not different things. No, they are not, I held her gaze. May I ask you something that is not polite dinner-table conversation? She considered. You may ask, I will decide about the answer. Are you aware of what my grandmother intends, of the design behind her arrangements? A long pause. The wind moved through the garden and lifted the edge of her cloak, and she pressed it down with the hand that held her book. I have been aware, she said at last, for approximately 4 years that your grandmother has some idea about me and your future. I have also been aware, and here she looked at me with that same direct, steady steadiness that she had leveled at me across the drawing room on the first night, that an idea in your grandmother's mind is not a commitment on your part or an expectation on mine. I have never permitted myself to expect, your grace. It is an efficient habit. The steadiness in her voice was genuine. The absence of hope in it, not bitterness, simply the careful excision of hope as a precaution against its loss, struck me somewhere in the chest with unexpected force. What if, I said, I were to tell you that I am not averse to the idea? She was very still for a moment. I would say, she answered quietly, that 11 years of refusing is a great deal to overcome in a walled garden in November. And yet, she agreed, and the corner of her mouth moved in that contained, careful way. November is surprisingly clarifying. I did not propose to her in the garden. It would have been too quick, too pressured, too much the conclusion of my grandmother's plot rather than the start of something that belonged to us. I wanted it to belong to us. That was new, a desire I had not previously articulated, but which arrived with the same sudden November clarity. I wanted, for the first time in 11 years, for the thing to be mine and not a performance staged for the county's chronometer. So instead I asked if I might call again. She said I might. I said I would come on Thursday, which was 2 days away. She said Thursday suited her, with the composed expression of a woman who had spent 4 years not permitting herself to expect, and was beginning, cautiously, to wonder whether the prohibition might be lifted. Thursday came. I brought a practical excuse, a question for my grandmother about the Aldenmere road that needed to pass through the dowager's land, and stayed 3 hours. My grandmother received her answer about the road in the first 15 minutes and then removed herself, with the grace of a woman who has won and sees no need to gloat, to the upper sitting room, leaving Alara Voss and me in the morning room with a fire and a tea tray, and the collected works of a great many authors she had placed therewith. I had no doubt, careful intention. We talked for 3 hours about the rail extension and the drainage channels, and whether the clergyman from Aldenmere had understood her point about the farmers. He had not, she said, but she expected he would think about it later and arrive at it slowly, which was satisfactory. About the mathematical problems in the margins of her father's book. About the estate at Strathmore and the question of the south drainage, which she had opinions on, unexpectedly. About the 3 novels my grandmother had placed on the shelf between us, 2 of which she had read, and 1 of which she had tried, and set aside for reasons she described, with a precise and cheerful dissection, that made me defend the wretched book purely for the pleasure of hearing her dismantle my defense. She also told me, somewhere in the second hour, how she had come to be at Strathmore, not the bare recitation she had given me at the window, but the fuller account offered without drama. The year she had spent after her father's death managing the house's dissolution, cataloging books for the auction that she had not known would take all 3, then arriving at the Dowager Duchess's door with a letter of introduction from a clergyman who had known her father, and a small valise that contained everything left to her in the world. My grandmother had looked her over for 1 long minute, asked her 2 questions, what she read and what she could do, and hired her before the clergyman's letter was finished being read. She told me later, Alara said, that the 2 questions were the only interview she ever needed, that what a person reads tells you what they think, and what they can do tells you what they are. She has applied this principle to my marriage for 11 years, I said. Yes, she looked at me over the tea tray with an expression I was beginning to understand as amusement held at arm's length from her face by long habit. I confess it is somewhat unsettling to have been the conclusion of a theory. You are not a theory, I said before I had decided to say it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, no, I suppose not. We sat with that for a little while. The fire needed no tending, and neither of us tended it. When I finally rode back to Strathmore in the early dark of a November afternoon, I understood, with a relief that surprised me by its depth, that the woman my grandmother had been hiding in the corner of her drawing rooms for 4 years was not a strategy. She was simply herself, and herself was the answer to a question I had not known I was asking. I came on Saturday. I came the following Tuesday, abandoning all pretense of estate business, and my grandmother met me at the door with the expression of a woman who has waited 11 years to say, "I told you so," and is savoring the restraint of not saying it. "She is in the library," my grandmother said. "I know where she is," I told her. "She is always in the library at this hour." My grandmother looked at me for a long moment. Then she patted my arm once, which was the warmest gesture she had offered me since I was 8 years old and had fallen from my first horse and cried from fright, and she went back upstairs. Alara was at the library table with 3 letters before her, managing my grandmother's correspondence, one of the dozen quiet, efficient tasks she performed for the household without complaint and with the thoroughness she brought to everything. She looked up when I came in, and the expression on her face did what it had been doing since the 2nd week, the careful containment, and then the small, real warmth that broke through it when she was not quite fast enough. "You are early," she said. "I am," I admitted. I sat in the chair across the table from her. The fire was low, and the room smelled of beeswax and old paper, and the particular cold afternoon scent of the house that I had known since childhood. And across the table was Alara Voss with ink on her right glove and 3 of my grandmother's letters in her careful hands. And I thought, there it is. There is the thing I have been refusing for 11 years without knowing what I was refusing. "Alara," I said. She set down the letters. "I have been thinking," I said, "about what you told me in the garden, about not permitting yourself to expect." "Yes, I should like," I said, "to ask your permission to give you something to expect." The room was very quiet. Outside, the November wind found the garden wall and passed on. The fire shifted. She looked at me for a moment with those honest eyes that had spent 6 years watching carefully and hoping nothing and understanding everything. And then the careful armor, the composed mask she had worn so long it had nearly become her face. Not the whole of her face, never that, but the shield she had built against a world that had taken everything and offered her nothing in return loosened. Not all at once. A gradual thing, like the first light of a morning that arrives before you have decided to be awake. A loosening of the jaw, a small, uncertain brightness in her eyes, the contained smile coming fully free at last, without restraint. "You will have to ask her, you know," she said. Her voice was steady, but the smile was not contained. "She will be insufferable about it." "I know," I said. "I am looking forward to the insufferability considerably." "She has been waiting 11 years. "She has been right 11 years. Those are different things." I leaned across the table, not touching her, not yet, not until I had asked properly and she had answered, but close enough to hold her gaze clearly. "Alara, may I speak to my grandmother, and after that may I speak to you again properly with a question that deserves a proper answer?" She looked at me for one more long moment, and in the expression on her face I read something I had not seen there before. Not the cautious, efficient management of hope, but hope itself, small and tentative and very real, permitted at last. "Yes," she said. "You may." I spoke to my grandmother that afternoon. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. She listened to me in silence, which was the most restrained thing she had done in our entire acquaintance, and then she looked at me with those sharp gray eyes and said, "I have known for 4 years that she was the right one. I have known for 11 years that you would need to find it out yourself. The only miscalculation I have ever made in this affair is that I expected it to take 8 years, not 11. "I am sorry to have kept you waiting," I said. "No, you are not," she replied. "But you are grateful, which is more useful." She paused. "Ask her properly, Callum. She has spent 6 years in this house being indispensable and asking nothing of anyone. Ask her with the weight the question deserves." I asked her that evening in the library, with the fire rebuilt and the November dark at the windows, and the 3 letters she had finished still neatly stacked at the corner of the table. I asked her without preliminaries, because she was a woman who valued honesty over performance, and I told her what I had understood in the garden and confirmed in the weeks since, that she was the most honest thing I had looked at in 11 years, and that I had spent those years looking for something I couldn't have named until I found it, and that what I had found was her. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "I have one question," she said. "Ask it." "Is this—" She paused, and for the first time I heard in her voice the faint, careful sound of someone who has not allowed themselves to hope for so long that the hope, when it arrives, feels uncertain, like a floor she is not sure will hold her weight. "Is this because your grandmother arranged it? Is that the whole of it?" "No," I said. It was the simplest answer I had ever given and the most certain. "My grandmother has been arranging things for 11 years. I have spent 11 years refusing arrangements. Whatever she arranged, I found you in a corner watching a frost, and I found you arguing about drainage channels at a dinner table, and I found you in this library with ink on your glove, and not one of those things was arrangement. Those were you." I held her gaze. "It is you I am asking." The floor held. She said yes. She said it simply in her direct, quiet way, and the smile that came with it, the real smile, the one she had spent years containing, was the most complete thing I had ever seen on a human face. We were married in January, at the chapel on the Strathmore estate, with snow on the ground and the county in attendance, and my grandmother in the front pew looking precisely as serene and certain as a woman who has solved a theorem, and waited patiently for the proof to arrive. Alara wore a gown of pale gold that the Strathmore seamstress had made in 6 weeks, and she walked into that chapel as she had entered every room I had ever seen her enter, with a quiet, unshowy composure that was more arresting than any entrance I had watched in 11 years of drawing rooms. She did not look around at the county assembled to witness the marriage of its duke. She looked steadily and entirely at me. I have thought often in the years since about what my grandmother knew and when she knew it. I have never asked her directly because she would tell me, and the answer would be both satisfying and humbling in roughly equal measure. What I know is this: she saw what I had not yet learned to see. She saw that the woman I needed was not the woman I would notice first, not the woman placed conveniently in my eye line, not the woman whose virtues were displayed for my inspection. She was the woman in the corner watching the frost, reading her father's marginalia, managing correspondence she was never required to manage and managing it with the thoroughness she brought to everything, asking nothing, expecting nothing, and being in every quiet particular exactly herself. I had refused 17 women in 11 years. I had been right to refuse them, not because there was anything wrong with them, there was not, but because I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for honesty, for a mind I had not yet measured and could not yet predict, for a woman whose composure was not performance but character, whose quiet was not absence but depth. My grandmother knew, she had always known. She told me once in the spring after the wedding, when Alara was in the garden with the warm season's first light on her, and I was watching from the library window with the particular helpless gratitude of a man who has been found rather than finding. "I did not choose her for you, Callum. I simply put her in the room and trusted that you were not entirely without sense." 11 years, I said. "You were slower than I expected," she allowed, "but you arrived." "I have arrived. Every morning since January of that year I have arrived, in the library or the garden or the long hall at Strathmore or wherever Alara happens to be, with the certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is going. She is there with ink on her glove, or a question about the south drainage, or a book open to the page where her father's handwriting runs into the margin. She looks up and finds me watching, and she does what she did in my grandmother's drawing room on the first night. She meets my eyes, steady and direct and entirely herself. Only now the contained smile comes free without hesitation. It has, these days, nothing left to contain. That is what my grandmother arranged. Not a wife chosen for her pedigree or her fortune or her position in the county's arithmetic, but a morning in November and a frost-bright window, and a woman brave enough to have expected nothing and wise enough, when hope finally arrived, to let it in. I have never thanked my grandmother adequately. I suspect she knows and finds it sufficient.